Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's event, Nothing About Us Without Us. I'm Nana Khanna, she or her pronouns, or they, with Positive Women's Network. And this event is being hosted by the U.S. People Living with HIV Caucus and a series of other people living with HIV networks, where we will be talking about the federal response. And I'm going to go ahead and introduce my co-moderator here, Ronald Johnson. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Ronald Johnson. I chair the steering committee for the U.S. People Living with HIV Caucus, and I'm really happy to be here with all of you.
Thank you so much. So we're really thrilled to have everybody joining us here today. We're going to give it a couple minutes for folks to come on. If you're on the live stream on Facebook, be sure to go ahead and share the link to your own Facebook page, any organizational Facebook pages you have, to just get everybody on the thread and watching this with us. Also, let us know that you're here. Go ahead and check in the comments on Facebook or YouTube. Introduce yourself. Let us know your name, your pronouns, where you're dialing in from. If you're with a particular organization or formation, we'd love to just have a sense of who's here. And then we also want folks to know that today's event is being recorded, and we are really thrilled to have you all joining us today. This event is streaming both on the U.S. People Living with HIV Caucus Facebook page, as well as the Positive Women's Network YouTube page. And so it can be shared from either of those locations. We're on a platform called StreamYard today, which might be new to some folks. Any of the comments you post on Facebook and YouTube, we'll be able to see them, and the presenters will be able to discuss and respond to them. And we're going to want your interaction and your thoughts kind of throughout this. So this event today, May the 4th be with all of us, is being co-hosted by the U.S. People Living with HIV Caucus, the Ribbon Consulting Group, Positively Trans, the New York Transgender Advocacy Group, NYTAG, National Working Positive Coalition, Zero Project, Thrive SS, and Positive Women's Network USA. You can go to the next slide, please. And so the flow of our event today is basically a welcome, which is what we're doing right now. Again, the U.S. People Living with HIV networks, talking about what we really want to see from the federal domestic HIV response, what could be different, what could actually transform the response structurally to be more accountable to people living with HIV. Then we'll go into some discussion and Q&A with all of you. And so we're looking forward to seeing your comments and interactions, questions, and things like that in the chat box. Then we'll go into a second panel that is really looking at, what does it mean to bring people living with HIV back into the federal HIV response? And we'll explain what we mean by that in a little bit. We have some fabulous presenters here with us today that we'll introduce a little bit later, but I think you can see, you can see their names up here. You're really going to be hearing from a range of perspectives, diverse range of perspectives. But this is really a group of people living with HIV networks that are coming together to say, these are the things that we see collectively. These are some problems we're identifying. And we also have a bunch of solutions we want to put forward and ask folks to think about. And we really want this to be a conversation with all of you. This is the first in a series of events and opportunities to engage that we will have with the people living with HIV network. So at the end, we'll go into a discussion and a Q&A, as well as opportunities to get involved and a closing. You can go to the next slide, please. So thank you. So I want to talk a little bit about what a Pl Hiv network is, this word that we're going to keep using, kind of throughout today's event and for the foreseeable future. As long as there's HIV, we will be organizing people living with HIV networks. So what is a Pl Hiv network? Well, networks of people living with HIV are basically formations that are organized and led by and for people living with HIV. Sometimes these are organizations, sometimes these are coalitions, sometimes they're like loose network structures. It doesn't, the network of people living with HIV doesn't have to do with having tax deductible status or anything. There are small grassroots networks. There are large global networks, like the Global Network of People Living with HIV, like the International Community of Women Living with HIV, and then there are networks of people living with HIV that are smaller, more regional, geographically specific or constituency specific. But the key characteristics shared by networks of people living with HIV are that the leadership is accountable to a constituency of people that are living with HIV, that we have mechanisms by which we consult with our base. We vet our priorities with a base. We get our priorities from a base, right? So when we speak, we're not necessarily representing an individual perspective. We're representing the perspective that we've heard from our members, our base, our constituency, and we're also able to be held accountable by that base and constituency. And we're presenting priorities that are coming from a collective with an organized voice. And so the US People Living with HIV Caucus in the United States is basically the largest kind of formation of networks, because it includes all of the different networks that I mentioned that are co-sponsoring this event today. All of us as Positive Women's Network, Thrive SS, Zero Project, Ribbon, National Working Positive Coalition, Positively Trans, all of the networks that I mentioned earlier are actually part of the US People Living with HIV Caucus. And so we're really glad to have you all here. And one of the distinctions we really want to make about what it means to hear from people living with HIV networks is that it's different. I think many of us have had the experience of being asked to participate as an individual in various spaces, which can be an experience that sometimes is really disempowering and even tokenizing, right? Like they're just trying to check a box sometimes and say, there's a person living with HIV at the table, or there's a brown woman living with HIV at the table, whereas being able to actually say, thank you for inviting me, but maybe I'm not the right person to be here, but I can recommend somebody else who is, and they're carrying a collective agenda on our behalf. So that's a little bit of the difference when we consult with people, with networks of people living with HIV versus individual people living with HIV. And so this is a group of networks of people living with HIV that collectively are representing thousands of people living with HIV across the US who are bringing you this event today. You can go to the next slide, please. Great. So I think with this, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Ronald, who's going to share with us some thoughts about where we're situated today in the current political moment and why this event is happening today.
Thanks, Nana. And again, welcome everyone. As we begin the discussion of how networks of people living with HIV are approaching the federal HIV response with our recommendations for sound public policies, we should recognize the current political moment and the overall political landscape. The political environment is an important structural issue that affects the HIV response. Public policies are not enacted based purely on their inherent soundness and logic, or because the policies are simply the right thing to do. Public policy is enacted through a political process, and the environment in which that political process takes place makes a big difference. The Biden-Harris administration has passed its 100th day in office. The political landscape of the past 100 days, and as we go forward, is drastically different from the landscape of the past 4 years. The Biden-Harris administration has taken actions already that, if carried through and followed up with further and more bold actions, can move the country towards a more progressive agenda that includes not only ending the HIV epidemic, but addressing the inequities and structural determinants that are driving the epidemic. The actions taken already include reversing the previous administration's policies that were aimed at erasing the civil and human rights of transgender people and blocking the public charge that would have limited undocumented immigrants' access to healthcare and other safety net programs. In his first speech to Congress, President Biden called out white supremacy and called for racial justice. Congress has passed the American Rescue Plan that not only provides needed COVID-19 relief, but included policies that affect the Affordable Care Act, including Medicaid expansion, and funding for much needed programs, including funds for an array of healthcare programs. The political environment has changed, but it is still very fragile. And we'll talk more about that in the next panel. What I want to stress now is that we as advocates must keep up and ramp up our advocacy and its pressure. A more friendly political climate is not enough. We must hold the administration and Congress accountable. During the previous administration, much of our actions were aimed at resistance. We still will resist when it's necessary. But now we must also persist. And that's why we're here this afternoon. Nana?
Great. Thank you so much, Ronald. Well said. And so we can go to the next slide, please. So, I think as Ronald laid out for us so eloquently, we're at this moment where we're basically just over, 100 days into this new administration. We all know the kind of political and cultural context we have been in for the last several years and how hard it has been for our communities. And today we are going to, be really thinking about the federal domestic HIV response as a whole and what we want to see from this administration, from the new Congress, in light of a number of policies that impact our lives every single day. So the previous administration put out something called the End the Epidemic Plan, which has basically sort of like 4 pillars that are driving the HIV response federally. We're going to be speaking a little bit to that. It's a very biomedical approach that I know many advocates think there's a lot of room to bring more depth and richness into that approach. Also, in the very last days of the previous administration, federal agencies released an HIV National Strategic Plan, which is designed to guide the federal response from a variety of federal agencies over the next 5 years. And so this is these are big national plans that are basically determining what the policy priorities are for the administration and Congress, how funding will get allocated, and what is thought about in terms of the HIV response. And so we're going to be talking about all of that. There are also programs like the Ryan White program and the HOPWA program on which many of us rely and depend. And we know that in fact, over 500,000 people living with HIV are getting services from the Ryan White program. And so there may be some ways that the Ryan White program needs to change to be updated to better serve people living with HIV in 2021. So we'll be talking a little bit about all of that today. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our first panel of fabulous speakers. So you're going to get to hear from Ronald Johnson, who introduced himself just a little while ago. Ronald is very humble about all of his expertise and accomplishments, but Ronald has a long legacy of really being on the front lines of fighting for all of us. And it is because of work of people like Ronald Johnson that I am even here today and able to do the things that I do. And so Ronald is not only the chair of the U.S. People Living with HIV Caucus today, but has worked throughout multiple administrations at the federal level on responses to the HIV epidemic, as well as in New York State, it has been key in the response and in many organizations in Washington, D.C., and also served on the President's Advisory Council on HIV/AIDS in the Clinton administration. Cecilia Chung, another one of my many sheroes in the movement, probably needs no introduction for many folks. Cecilia is a longtime human rights advocate, the founder of Positively Trans, has been engaged in local, state, national, and even global advocacy on the HIV response, and really has done so much to uplift the federal and the global response as it pertains especially to transgender women of color living with HIV, and really demand accountability on a whole range of issues. And I'm just so grateful that she's here with us today. And finally, my co-director, Vanita Ray, the amazing Vanita Ray from Positive Women's Network USA, who is an attorney by training and has had so many different kinds of experiences in community organizing even before she got involved in the HIV community, and brings all of that expertise and that wisdom to the work that she does now to really build power, especially for Black communities and folks in the South, around demanding a racially equitable, racially just, and gender equitable and gender justice driven response to the epidemic in the United States. And so these three really fantastic speakers I know are going to have a lot of wisdom to share with us today. So I want to just invite them, first of all, to open up with one question. How would you describe where we are today with respect to the domestic federal HIV response, and what opportunities and challenges do you see? And I'm going to invite any of you to start off, and then others can pick up.
Okay, I'll start. I think, and thank you so much, Nana, and I really feel honored to be with Cecilia and Ronald here. I think, as Ronald kind of laid out for us, that we are at a critical political and cultural moment globally and in the US for people living with HIV and our communities that are vulnerable to HIV. We've made a lot of progress. We would, if you think about the 2020 election and outcome, and folks way before me, I was diagnosed in 2003, and folks way before me made a lot of progress. We lost a lot of ground in this last administration, but what I really think, we having a more favorable administration, all of that puts us in a different place. And Ronald talked about President Biden, really calling out white supremacists and all that. But we still have continued threats to access to sexual health care services, access to health care, Medicaid expansion, folks, and I think COVID really highlighted the fragility of our healthcare system, how fragile it is. We've got a conservative Supreme Court that really, under this last administration, we're all kind of on pins and needles waiting to see what comes out of this. We've got threats, even with what happened in 2020, to political power through, over 350 voter suppression bills in 47 states, in response to the outcome of 2020. We've got white supremacists and white fragility just exponentially on the rise in this last 4 years, and even more so now with our amazing, VP, now Vice President Harris. We've got, with the Supreme Court that I just talked about, threats to our bodily autonomy and voting that I talked about before. We've got a federal response that's focused on prevention, in my opinion, and biomedical kind of solutions that don't always address the issues that people living with HIV have, and as well as a lack of transparency and just inapproachable in the past. And we're hoping that it will change a federal government that's inclusive. So what we've seen in COVID, what we've seen around racial disparities aren't new, but folks are talking about it like it's new, but those are continuing challenges. And even though President Biden mentioned about root and systemic racism, calling that out, we have the challenge of making that be more than just words. I'm really kind of a little skeptic that I want to see action. I want to see access. I want to see more. And so some of the opportunities I think that we have now is to be a little bold, to really focus on building power in our community, to really demand accountability from those folks that we just put into office, to really do something around the voting rights and around healthcare. That, how do we expand access for folks? What about universal healthcare? How do we stop voter suppression? I'm not impressed with our Congress still not acting to do more with the way that they've seen the states do. I want to see more on racial equity. And since President Biden and Vice President Harris are talking about it, how do we make that real? How do we make sure that it includes the things that we want it to include? You know, we've had this increased activity around folks talking against anti-Blackness and racism. How do we do more than make that it be in Facebook mad and mad on social media, but does that translate at the voting box and other places? And you know, in this increased attention to anti-Blackness and racism. How do we, I think we have an opportunity and need to do more about maintaining the safety net for our low incomes and vulnerable communities. And so I see all these as opportunities. I see it's time to be bold. There's, you know, I don't think this is not the time to be, you know, trying to be incremental and time to be trying to get along. I think this is the time to step up, be bold, and demand accountability from others. So thank you all.
I want to just jump in really quickly and add to what Vanita has said. You know, like I think that Vanita had really eloquently like listed a lot of like what we could do and what, you know, like the government should be doing. And I think that in the way that I see it, you know, I think when it comes to resources, you know, like there is still a colonization of resources, which means, you know, like not all resources are being utilized equally for all Pl Hiv, you know, and, you know, especially when we look at how rural area is being funded and how urban area is being funded. So those are like arbitrary disparities caused by, you know, the system itself, you know, and this is an opportunity for us to engage our representatives and legislators and let them know that, you know, like when we talk about health equity, that means eliminating a lot of these kind of like arbitrary limitations, you know, including, you know, who gets support, you know, like for services, you know, like, and questions like, you know, like eligibility. Why would we ask somebody about their immigration status when we want everybody, you know, like to live like with a good health outcome? So there are a lot that we can do to change, you know, and one other things that I want to just touch on is language justice. You know, like one of our colleague, Marco say a lot about language justice, which, you know, also resonate with me, being somebody from a different country, born and raised, you know, with another language, you know, like other than English, you know. So, you know, to really understand and, you know, and build like health literacy means that we have to understand exactly what was the kind of information we're receiving, what it means, you know, and so we can ask appropriate questions. So we don't live in a vacuum, and neither should the healthcare systems, you know, that we're accessing. You know, it must be tailored to our needs, you know, and it must recognize our humanities and our individualities.
I would say all of the above, certainly. And I think when we look at the domestic federal response, I think at the moment we're in a good place, but it is not a solid place, as Vanita and Cecilia noted the many threats. So the domestic response is still, as it should be, a work in progress, and that's why our advocacy is so important. And as we approach the 41st anniversary, the 41st year, with the 40th anniversary, if you can call it that, next month, we still have so much more to do. And when we look at particularly in the populations that both Vanita and Cecilia mentioned and the issues, I would add older adults living with HIV and all people who are aging with HIV. And we need to think of the care structure that we need for the next 20 to 30 to 40 years, because that's how long people living with HIV will be, hopefully, with the treatments, and that we need more to accessing it. So I think we're in a good place, by no means a solid place, and the kind of boldness that Vanita talked about is very, very important, and we'll be talking about that throughout the day.
Thank you so much. Powerful opening comments. I think one specific question I want to ask you all is, how can the federal response better attend to the needs of communities most impacted by the HIV epidemic? You all have kind of alluded to this, but specifically, what do we need to see happen? What's missing? What do we need to see happen in the federal response?
So let me get started with this, and and then Vanita and Ronald, please feel free to jump in at any time. I think that Vanita, when like she responds to the first question, like she mentioned about like meaningful involvement of people living with HIV and AIDS, and so what it means is that we are allowing ourselves to be the experts of our own lives in the implementations and the designs and and the priorities of services and interventions that would help us live a longer life and have better health outcomes. But right now that's not how the system is set up. Like we have researchers, but a lot of the researchers treat pure HIV like some kind of like animal testing. So like we get to participate, but we were never, being informed what the findings are. We're always the last to know like what's going on. And how can you say that that's about our life when we can tell you directly, like what we need to improve, like our quality of life. And also, the way that we are looking at data, it's a very piecemeal approach, so like if they don't ask certain questions about a certain group, then we wouldn't know anything, and case in point, like up till today, like when we look at all the data that impacts like pure HIV and the demographic, rarely do they ask, enough about, like the gender diversity in the communities. Yes, like there's men, there are women, but there's also transgender men, transgender women, and also some non-binary folks who are not actually visible at all, in any of our national HIV strategies so far. And and with no visibility means that it's hard to allocate adequate resources, and and it's harder to explore like what the needs that part of the community is. One of the things that I want to really highlight is like with our trans men, in this HIV response, like for a long time we kept saying that like trans men are low risk of HIV, but guess what? Between 2015 and 2019, since they start like desegregating the data, like the number of trans men who are receiving Ryan White services went from 325 in 2015 to 1,676 in 2019. That's a 3 times increase. So they represent 0.1 of the populations in 2015, and they represent 0.3 of the populations in 2019. So if we don't pay attention, to these particular communities, we're going to see what happened with, the Asian and Pacific Islander community as well. Like that, there's going to be an increase while everybody else's HIV rates are plateauing. So that's not how we want to be treated. We want to make sure that the data speaks a full stories, not just part of the stories. We don't want any more siloing. We don't want any more piecemeal of like what they think we need. And we don't need political correctness, like to know that, sex workers need to be included in the plan, and people need not to be punished for seeking care.
Yeah, those are such important points. And I think, just to highlight some of what Cecilia is raising, we really need every federal agency to be consistently collecting data on sexual orientation and gender identity. Otherwise, communities are invisible, and it becomes very difficult, if not impossible, to allocate resources appropriately, to develop services that are gender responsive, culturally responsive, et cetera, to fund in the ways that things really need to be funded. And And then also on the issue of sex workers, we saw that in the HIV National Strategic Plan, which is supposed to be a very comprehensive approach to the domestic HIV epidemic, sex workers are nowhere actually in the plan yet, and need to be added. And there's really an opportunity right now, because there is the HIV National Strategic Plan that's been released, but all of the agencies are right now developing their implementation plans. And so we want to see clear commitments to sex workers, and to some of the other issues that folks have been raising, like language justice, and access to care and services for immigrants in those implementation plans. They are not currently there at this time. So that's a real opportunity. Anita, would you like to add?
Yeah, thank you. So I want to just take a step back and first of all, tell folks we are more than our CD4 and viral load count. We need folks to see us as whole people, and never mind, when Cecilia talked about what's not in the data, I want when folks, there is a real culture of blaming and shaming communities for being vulnerable to HIV or being so impacted by HIV, when there's real structural and systemic problems that at the root of those problems are issues of racism, discrimination, homophobia, transphobia. We want to always, the response right now is so biomedical focused, which is topical Band-Aid solutions, because we don't want to do the hard work of dealing with the root causes of why Black and brown communities or trans communities are most impacted by HIV. I want folks to stop talking about the data without context. When you're sitting in a room and they talk about data and you feel like you're, just a target on your back versus explain the data. There's more going on there. And, just for myself, being a Black woman living with HIV, we represent 60% of all women living with HIV, but we don't hear folks talk about Black women. And when I say Black, I'm not talking about African-American, I'm talking about the range of Black women and all of our diversity living at the intersection of race and gender. So there's gender equity issues, there's race equity, racial equity issues. And when you look at the EHE response, the 47 jurisdictions, what they have in common is race. Those are primarily Black and brown communities, but nowhere in the response does it talk about that race is an issue or dealing with racism and poverty and access to healthcare. So I really, would love to see us stop talking about the symptoms of the problem, which HIV is one, and talk about the real issues of what the real issues are, which are at the crux of why our communities are most impacted. If biomedical solutions alone would get it, wouldn't we have been out of this? Can we educate or condomize our way out of this epidemic? I don't think so. We need to deal with some structural and systemic issues around race and gender equity and access. And I love that Cecilia talked about, rural communities and addressing those specific needs instead of treating people as if they are the problem versus the structural and systemic issues that are the problem. So racism, no one likes to talk about it, but it's at the heart. If we look at all of those issues that are root causes, they all go back to income, low income. They go back to poverty. They go back to all of those isms that we talk about that we do not address. So I would love to see the federal response. Biomedical has its place, but biomedical without dealing with these other structural and systemic issues are just more of the same. So I want to see a more holistic approach when you're talking about people living with HIV. We're not about just being adherent. We're about the quality of life that we want, not about fitting a definition of whether we're compliant and adherent. Those terms are punitive. We're talking about a quality of life of human beings and dignity. And so we need the language to change, we need the focus to change, and we need structural and systemic issues of race and gender to be discussed and dealt with.
And I would add to that is that we need to enable what Vanita and Cecilia have been talking about. We need leadership. And it's very disturbing to me that 100 days into this epidemic, this administration, we still have no public inkling that a director for the Office of National AIDS Policy is appointed. We need a strong person in the White House, participating on the Domestic Policy Council, arguing for the very things that we are talking about. that have to be involved in the HIV response. That entails leadership, and that leadership ought to be in the White House in the person of a director for national AIDS policy.
Thank you so much.
And I think we left out one issue about meaningful involvement of folks living with HIV in the response. And so if you don't ask us, you're just guessing on what to do for us. So either it's by and with us, just like our title says, nothing about us without us, you must be including us. And mostly the federal response is prevention focused, and the way that they address our quality of life issues is clear that you haven't talked to us. So we need to be included, and our inclusion needs to be defined by us. When we say MIPA, meaningful involvement of people living with HIV, other folks don't get to tell us what that means. Ask one of us.
I want to jump in one more. Meaningful involvement also means that we get adequately compensated for the emotional labor we as people living with HIV put into presentations and panels. You know, like it's not like it's a privilege for us to be invited to the panel, because every time when that happens, you know, like it opens back up a lot of the trauma we experience. And it's not just a thank you that we need, you know, like we need resources to help us, you know, like to overcome some of these and to survive. So if we don't get compensated, that sends a really poor message to the entire community that our time and our lives is not worth, you know, like the value, you know, that we are contributing.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yes, boom, boom, snap, snap. Y'all are just bringing it. You're really providing a lot of food for thought, I think, for all of our listeners and for myself. Thank you. And I think part of what I hear you all lifting up is that there are ways that we can actually build into the federal response these elements of things like meaningful involvement of our communities. The point that you lifted up, Ronald, about ONAP, I want to just really highlight what Ronald is saying, is that the Office of National AIDS Policy, we don't have one yet in the Biden-Harris administration. It needs to be reconstituted. There are questions about where it will sit and how much access it will have to decision-making power once it is set up. There are also questions about who will be leading it and what their lenses will be that they're bringing to that office. So there are there are recommendations that have already been put forward by the people living with HIV networks in the process of developing comments on the HIV National Strategic Plan around what this should look like. That ONAP should be situated in a place where it has a direct relationship to the Domestic Policy Council and is advising the president and the Office of the President on federal policy. That ONAP should be led by and staffed by those reflecting the communities most impacted by the HIV epidemic. And we're very clear that that is Black and brown people, that is transgender women, that is gay and bisexual men, that is people living with HIV. We know who we're talking about when we say communities most impacted by the epidemic. There are also opportunities, in other countries, there are written in civil society mechanisms for networks to participate, Pl Hiv networks to participate in federal decision making. So rather than them saying, oh, we asked for comments and we got 200 comments, and so we involved the community, there are mechanisms that can be used, like saying, we're reserving a couple of seats on the Presidential Advisory Council on HIV/AIDS for delegates from the U.S. people living with HIV caucus to have an accountable voice in those bodies, or on the CDC HRSA Advisory Committee and the Office of AIDS Research Advisory Council, these major advisory bodies that are providing guidance to federal agencies on what the federal domestic response should look like. Those could actually have sitting seats designated for people living with HIV networks. So there are a lot of opportunities at a structural level to change the way that the response is happening. I know that folks have talked a little bit about MIPA. Is there anything you want to add about meaningful involvement in the response and what you'd like to see that look like?
One thing I would add is that, and it's the theme of accountability has already been mentioned today, but to continue that, we need MIPA community engagement to be built into the system and the process in such a way that states and local jurisdictions are held accountable for making community engagement a reality. It should not be seen as an optional choice for jurisdictions or something that they do to check off a box. It should be a viable, real part of plans at all levels. And the CDC, HRSA, should hold jurisdictions accountable for the degree to which they meaningfully involve the community. I don't see that accountability being carried out at the moment, and that must be, in my opinion, a key part of the federal response, is that community engagement is not optional. It is an integral part, and jurisdictions will be held accountable for achieving it.
And also making sure that the language in the plan is easier to understand by everyone, not just, like some professionals or academic, because by doing that, we're excluding who's the most impacted a lot of times. So in order to do that, we really need to decolonize, like who we think is a qualified experts, like in these strategies and also in drafting this plan.
So the last thing I would say about MIPA in the federal response is I hear with EHE and other efforts that community engagement gets mentioned a lot. And I don't think there's a real shared understanding of what folks are talking about. It's mentioned as a vision, not a requirement. And folks will say that they did it because they involve planning bodies or whatever, which is I live in Houston, 4 million people. Our planning body is 38 people. So you work through that planning body and call it engagement because it's the easiest. Or you say we're hard to reach when you got a group like Thrive SS 7 years ago started something, and now they're reaching thousands of guys because you said they were hard to reach. We want more effort put into us defining what engagement really looks like when it involves our community, instead of these low barrier ideas or tokenizing ideas of what engagement should be. And there's no real definition. So when we say community, you're talking about agencies, you're talking about everything else. We need community engagement defined for people living with HIV. There's so many efforts being done by our community that are easy to tap into. You could look at undetectable equals untransmittable, started by a person living with HIV, being run by people living with HIV. They're not invisible. The Caucus, everybody we just talked about here, who we are here, we are not invisible. We're not hard to find. So we have access to thousands of people, positively trans, thrive. So we are the ones who need to be talking about what MIPA looks like and should look like. And it should be a requirement. If folks don't check the box according to our definition of what meaningful engagement is, it's not happening. Because we've got plans out there right now that don't reflect us, don't look at our needs, don't address our quality of life, but yet folks will say they engage the community. So it's by and for us. We're the ones that define what it is. We're not hard to find, and we are ready to be partners in this effort. But if you have not engaged us, be prepared, because now is the time we need to hold those agencies accountable. You can't end the epidemic without us. And end it for whom? Is it ending it for Black women? Is it ending it for white gay men? Who are you ending it for if you're not talking to us?
Yes. Snap, snap, snap. Thank you. Thank you all. So we do want to transition and hear from our next panel soon, but I think the last question I want to just put to this panel is about a specific issue in the federal response that is like kind of an underpinning of the response. And that is this issue of molecular HIV surveillance. This is an issue that is being raised consistently as a concern by people living with HIV networks. If you look at the End the Epidemic federal plan, it is one of the 4 pillars. If you look at the HIV National Strategic Plan, molecular HIV surveillance is really hidden, but it's still there. It's masked as, using data effectively to drive the response. What is molecular HIV surveillance in a nutshell? Why are people living with HIV networks sounding the alarms about this? And what should folks be thinking about? Vanita, would you mind starting on this one?
Sure. So molecular HIV surveillance in a nutshell is the use of our data that's collected during a routine drug resistance lab visit testing that breaks it down and compares the genetic sequence of our DNA and the sequence of our virus to identify the similarities with other people that may be in our community. And it leads to something that they're now calling cluster detection, where they can identify clusters with similar genetic sequencing of a particular HIV that folks have in the community. And we did not find out about this until a couple years ago, even though it had been rolled out years ago. And this presents another example of a mechanism or actions being taken without involvement or our consent. So let me just say that we go in for a lab visit because we've talked with our doctor and we've decided on a course of treatment. And other folks have decided to use our data or use our physical information for another purpose without our consent. And using that to supposedly map where people live and where HIV is similar. Again, not done with our consent, rolled out without talking to us. And we have raised issues that are associated with this around privacy, consent, the way that our data is being used. We have vulnerable communities that this data is being rolled out. So because folks have said, well, we need this so that we can make sure we get services to the community. There's been no cost benefit that we've seen that showed us that the increased risk to our safety that this kind of surveillance provides, whether it's for our trans community, our sex worker community, our immigrant community, or already over surveilled communities, that there's been no efficacy really shown why this should be done and how it's being done without our consent. What happens is, because HIV is a public health issue, in the name of public health, folks can violate the privacy rights of people living with HIV. It ignores the humanity of people living with HIV, and HIV is a public health threat, not human beings who happen to be living with HIV. So this technology rolled out, folks are in love with the science of it. I didn't even mention that on issues around, you'll hear later around HIV criminalization, that this technology, the threat of it and the use of it is being used to put people behind bars who may or may not have done anything wrong for consensual sex. And so it violates our body autonomy by us choosing who sees and gets access to our information. It violates the privacy rights. It violates the privacy of our relationship with our doctors, and it puts public health officials in the middle. So you build mistrust because they're the people who are sharing this information with the CDC and others who are using this information. So one more time, we've asked for a moratorium on this so folks, CDC and others, can respond to our issues, and we have largely been ignored, and this is still being done in violation, I feel, of our human dignity and of our rights of bodily autonomy.
So powerful. Yeah, thank you all so much. And we did have the chat is on fire, by the way, the comments coming in on Facebook. We are going to transition to the next panel, and we'll have an opportunity to engage with some of those comments and questions later. But I just want to say that, Malcolm Reed, one of my favorite people from Thrive SS, talked about MEPArizing the federal response. And I think that's so much of what you all have spoken to. We have questions about how to, incorporate storytelling and qualitative data as part of the work. You all are getting a lot of affirmations on this this idea of like fairly compensating people living with HIV and most impacted communities as part of meaningful involvement and what that looks like. And then also there are some questions about specific examples, about, you know, best practices that maybe we can talk through later. And then folks are also lifting up concerns about molecular surveillance in light of HIV criminalization laws, which is very real and, you know, a very important concern. And it's exactly why the networks are pushing back on this and saying, you rolled this out, you rolled it out without our consent, without our knowledge. We didn't even know our data was being used by this, you know, like this. In many states, there are, there's like, they have like 60 or 80% of the genomic sequences of people living with HIV in those states that they already have access to. Did we know our data was being taken and used like this? No. Many of those states also have laws that criminalize people living with HIV. So it's very dangerous. So we'll come back and hopefully have more time to talk about some of these things. I want to thank this incredible panel for kicking us off today. And I'm going to go ahead and let's thank them. They'll be back with us to be in some discussion later in this session. And we're going to bring our second set of panelists on with our fabulous and fierce next moderator, Linda Scruggs from the Ribbon Consulting Group. For those who don't know Linda, I think everybody knows Linda, but for those who may not know Linda, she is not only one of the most stylish and fierce and inspiring people I have ever met. She is also a birthday queen, and it was her birthday yesterday. So please wish Linda a happy birthday. And Linda's gonna set us off with our next panel here.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Nana. I am so excited. Like, honored to be here. I'm watching the chat on Facebook, what's happening, everything that's going on. Nana, Ronald, Vanita, you guys, Cecilia did a great job setting the stage, right? Talking about this is what the federal strategy says. This is kind of what they want. But I love the person who said we need to MAPERize. You know, we really need to have a conversation because there's some things we need. As a woman diagnosed with HIV for over 30 years, you know, I love the call for accountability, equity across the border, you know, across all areas. A revision in the Iran White Care Act. You know, it has not been revised since 2006, 2008 somewhere. Does it meet our needs today? Accessing primary care for immigrants. All of these are things that we heard. One of the things that I love, I think it was Vanita May has said it, you know, no more Band-Aids. You know, we're not taking Band-Aids anymore. We need to address the root cause, and not just the root cause of a few people to satisfy us at the moment, but really looking at the whole entire part of who we are as people living with HIV. Not only you can't do it without us, we're not going to allow you to do it without us. Ronald said it at the top of the conversation. We will argue. We will fight. We'll come after you if that's what we need to do. This is the beginning of a dialogue, but it's really not the end. So to help me finish this discussion, I want to invite my panelists to come in. I'm going to, Vanessa Johnson is going to be with us from Ribbon. Lorenza Lewis from Thrive SS is with us. Marco is with us. Come on in, everybody. I'm excited to see you. Everyone's smiling. I know you're a hot fire. I wrote all these notes while the chat was going on. They really transitioned us to around the policy pieces, right? But as a person living with HIV, what I really want, you know, you guys to do is to bring in the piece for us. I didn't see Kiara. Is Kiara here?
I am here.
Okay, here she come. All right. Everybody's here. I love it. So I really want us to begin the framing. I want to ask each one of you to introduce yourself. You know, of course, give us your pronouns and all that, but also tell us, you know, as you representing a network of people living with HIV, but also very personally, what does the human right approach mean when we're talking about a response, you know, and being responsive to what HIV looks like? Hey, Marco, can I start with you?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Perfect. I love the question because I actually made an intentional change on my advocacy. I used to work for Lambda Legal, and for many years I would like work like crazy. Yeah, an organization that was not race positive to begin with, but I would work really tirelessly, and I realized that the communities that I was the most close to, the ones that I was working with, which is the undocumented community, sex workers, transgender community, they didn't get a lot of benefits from my work. And so I realized that the civil rights, when we fight for civil rights, we don't really include everybody. We include those that have papers, that have benefits, and those who need the most help are the government, and it's not enough. It's not enough. And so we need to be proactive and we need to be creative, because that's why I love the work that I do at HIV Racial Justice now, and I love the framework that we have written that is called a Declaration of Liberty.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Marco. Thank you. That's incredible. Who wants to jump in? I don't want
time.
Okay.
I'm gonna close my mic, my cam, so it can be maybe better, the reception. Okay. Thank you, Linda.
Yeah, I'd like to comment. Thank you. My name is Vanessa Johnson. She, her. I'm part of Ribbon, as well as many of the people living with HIV networks that are represented on this event. And I just wanted us to have a clear understanding that although the United States Constitution provides strong protections for our civil and political rights, so they say, given what's happening today, that could be debated, it fails to recognize economic, social, and cultural rights that are guaranteed by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And because these rights are not viewed as rights unless because of eligibility and whether or not people are being discriminated, it does not address the underlying problem of failing to guarantee for all people in the United States an adequate standard of living and other rights necessary to ensure our quality, our dignity, and respect. So I think we have to do a lot of education, not just in our community, but in society at large, as to why human rights are important.
Oh, I love it. I love it. Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you. Kiara, are you ready?
Yeah.
You want to come on, lady?
Happy birthday, Goddess.
Thank you. Thank you.
So my name is Kiara St. James. My pronouns are she, her, Goddess. I'm the founder and executive director of New York Transgender Advocacy Group. And one of the reasons why I founded New York Transgender Advocacy Group was under the conversations we've been having. The previous panel did an amazing job really highlighting, that we have to address root causes of disparities within our various communities that are here today. And so understanding as a Black woman of trans experience that one does not simply get HIV because I am Black, I'm a woman, or I'm trans, but it's because of access to opportunities, right? But also the fact that it's not just violence that my community specifically deal with, walking down the street, and somebody may want to throw a bottle or, even worse, but it's the structural violence that has existed since the establishment of this criminal enterprise called the United States of America, right? And so what we have to start addressing, and what I try to do here in New York City, is address the root causes of discrimination, but also approach it with a holistic approach, and as someone who identifies as being African, ways of knowing who were we before we were told we were this, right? And so that's something that we have to really get back to. And the fact that we live in a society that is really rooted and dictated by cis white men saying these are the communities that are we're going to praise and we're going to center, mainly cis white men, cis white women. In other communities, we're going to if they're lucky, we'll throw them some scraps. And I feel one of our responsibilities today is really to address that. And I love the approach of meaningful involvement. People living with HIV is so important and critical at this time. And understanding that I tell people, like, we have to not make the same mistake we did with Obama, right? For 8 years, we stayed at the inauguration. I'm talking about Black folks, right?
Come on now.
We stayed at the inauguration. We did not demand as much as we could have. It's our responsibility to remind Biden and Harris that it is because of us, Black women, Black LGBTQIA folks, Black men, that Biden and Harris is in office. And so we have a responsibility to say we want a return in our investment for putting you in office. And that means the $674 million that he's allotting to HIV and AIDS, we should get the bulk of that. When I say we, Black and brown folks, Black women, Black trans women, Black men, Black trans men, Latinx folks, we should get the bulk of that funding. And because what happens a lot, especially here in New York City, is that the bigger organizations, multi-million-dollar organizations with a budget of $60 million a year, they are the first one that gets funded with money that should go into communities. And I talk about often, we have to start addressing when folks are saying, organizations specifically are saying, we don't have, our organization is not Black, it's not brown, but we do target them. We don't want to be targeted. We want to be centered. And so we have to make sure that we demand that Black and brown organizations that are led by us, that we are funded and that we are not like targeted by cis white organizations who get to police the purse strings for us. And so, yeah, I think it's really important that we all start pushing to create that world that we want to see come out on the other side, not just HIV, but COVID-19 as well.
COVID as well, right? Because we're dealing with multiple pandemics. Kara, that's fabulous. I love, and I didn't think about the framework that many of us stayed at the inauguration, right? I went to 2 of those Obama balls. I mean, did we get too wound up in it that we really didn't get it? And I think it still goes back to what Ronald said. We're holding folks accountable. And we will fight. I added the piece, we'll come at you, because it really did take, our village is the one that took you over. So we have expectations. This is hard being a moderator because I'm like on fire over here, got a lot to say. But Lorenzo, come on, talk to me a little bit. What does it mean? What does human rights approach to HIV response look like? And then I'm going to ask you guys also to start talking about biomedical interventions and rights-based. So in that sense, because just transitioning us, it's a lot to say. But come on, Lorenzo, start us off.
Well, thank you, Linda, and happy birthday.
Thank you.
Lorenzo, my pronouns are he, him, his. And I'm a member of the Self-Love, HIV Acceptance, and Power Building Department of Thrive Support Services in Atlanta. Thinking about your question, I cannot help but be just a little sad because right now in Atlanta, it's raining, right? And people living with HIV are out there in the rain without housing. But I'm gonna get to that. Let me start answering your question, all right? The human rights approach really, to me, looks like going back to the fundamental human needs. We need security, we need shelter, we need support. And it also looks like having a disposition of service instead of satisfying the consumer. You know what I mean? We're not consumers. We are people fully deserving of everything this country has to offer. And there's an urgency missing in ending the epidemic that is not applied to us because, like Vanessa was saying, that dignity, that respect for us as a people is not there. So it looks like caring, and it looks like going back to those fundamental needs for me.
That's great, guys. We're gonna have to do some speed dating. I know it's a lot going on, but I do want you guys to just talk a little bit, maybe a couple of you talking about the difference between biomedical interventions and rights-based interventions for people living with HIV. Who want to tackle that one?
I can give it a go.
Okay.
So definitely, my organization is a grassroots, so I actually love the grassroots approach as opposed to biomedical like when I think of biomedical, I think about, scientists somewhere, kind of like what folks were saying before, using our data to really like trace us without our consent, and I really feel that what we have to start doing is making sure that we have a say-so in how our data is going to be used. And it's not just HIV data. I did what's it called? 23andMe, right? So even that data is being used, right, to trace my DNA, right? And so I think the first thing we're going to have to do is educate our community on the pros and cons of biomedical, because there's some pros, I imagine, but for the most part, it's an invasion of privacy when folks are doing it, scientists are doing it without our consent. And I do feel like the grassroots effort is really important, educating the community. One of the things we talk about within NITAG itself, micro, meso, macro, those are the three components to advocacy, right, as well as policy work. And so that meso part is going to be very essential, that we all have to educate our community on their rights when it comes to how their medical records are going to be used, because we live in a time where it's very easy to have access to our medical records online without our consent. A lot of these medical facility, establishments, they get hacked all the time and things get leaked. And so, so definitely, my main concern is making sure that any information about us is information that has our consent. I don't know if I touched on what you asked. So.
Yeah, I'm going to ask Vanessa to comment real quick, then I'm going to transition to the second question because they're going to get us. All right.
Okay. All right. So I want to talk about it in the context of quality of care and quality of life. So the standard for quality of care for our people must support a holistic approach to care, which goes beyond the medical aspects that Kira was talking about. Therefore, we have to create a common understanding of what is quality of life and ensure that this leads to investment in addressing those structural factors that Lorenzo started talking about. And that while we understand that quality of care must include a standard, and what I want to say is that quality of care must include a standard of care across our lifespan that is easily understood by our community. So while quality of care services in the HIV National Strategic Plan also include mental health, substance use, and reproductive services, we must fight to ensure optimal quality, meaning optimal quality, meaning that all services must be delivered in a trauma-informed, harm reduction, and health-centered way.
Right.
And that quality of care must also be gender responsive to all our gender identities and culturally relevant to all our racial and ethnic identities. I'm trying to talk fast because there's some real key points I want to make. So to ensure this, the Federal Interagency Task Force Steering Committee must direct the indicator subcommittee to add additional metrics for measuring and assessing quality of care. Right now, there's only one, and that's housing. But we know quality of care encompasses more than just housing. It is critical, no doubt about it, but it goes beyond that. And we want to also recommend that Ryan White program funding formulas and structures create the ultimate impact towards ending the HIV. In other words, and this is what I think, that Ryan White should become like a universal healthcare program. It should be available to anybody in the United States that's living with HIV. That way we can ensure quality of care and a quality of life.
Wow, Vanessa. That's a perfect transition into our next question. Thank you for that. I think it was Benita Ray said in the chat that they can't educate, test, and prep our way out of the HIV epidemic. There's some real work, structural work that's going to have to be done at all. I mean, it's almost like some crisscross puzzle that we can't just start one word at a time. We can't start one place or one population or one part of the country at a time. It really have to be structural. And I love that you said, why can't we have this for everyone? I'm a transition because you started talking about housing, right? So we know, but I want to transition when you're thinking about the current version, right? Not the final version, the current version of the HIV National Strategy Plan, thinking about people living with HIV, what is missing for us, right? Talk to me a little bit, Lorenzo. I know you earlier you were talking about you want to talk about housing. Jump on us with some housing pieces. Guys, I'm gonna ask you to speed date a little bit. I see in the chat they're saying seniors and all this stuff. So come on, Lorenzo.
Really quickly, I just want to go back to that last question and just a quick example of how a biomedical approach would show up. It would show up in, for example, in the survey with the overuse of the word infect or infected. You know what I mean? Whereas the human-based approach would have language that is less stigmatizing for me as a person living with to even take the survey. So just really mention that we, it's very pervasive. With housing, now I live in Atlanta, and the first thing anyone would say of the housing situation in Atlanta is that it's a mess. We are a rapidly gentrifying city. There is a severe lack of affordable housing, and there is a significant red tape when it comes to HOPWA. When community-based organizations try to be a part of the solution and try to provide some remedy for people living with, especially Black same-gender loving men who are, super affected, can't afford to do so. We don't get to do so because it takes months and sometimes over a year for landlords, organizations, agencies to be reimbursed to where they cannot even provide that service and be a part of that solution. And it's not only not helping to end the epidemic, it's making it worse.
Wow. And that's a story we see across the country when we talk about housing. It's not unique to Atlanta. So even when there's resources and things, there's so many other pieces that really create barriers. Marco, come on for a minute and talk to us about, when we're thinking about what's missing in the current version of the plan. I know, and Cecilia mentioned it earlier, around language justice, so we're saying that this has to be for everyone. How does language justice play a role there?
Well, I wanted to just go back a little bit about the plan. The plan doesn't mention communities that are actually at the most vulnerable. They don't mention undocumented immigrants. Well, the president already did. Why don't we all follow then? Because we need to stop being politically correct when it comes to HIV ending the epidemic. Because politically correct is not going to take us to end HIV because we're not including everybody in this. And so undocumented people, you should get used to actually name and write undocumented people in your communiques because they're part of our society and they deserve everything that you have. Sex workers as well, and people that inject drugs or that use drugs, the transgender community, all of those, there's people with disabilities, and because they experience, as we know, the discrimination in different forms. And very quickly, language justice, in my opinion, is missing because it's not included, because it's always an afterthought. People don't even know the difference between interpretation and translation, which is interpretation is spoken, translation is written. But so we cannot translate a webinar. Well, you can translate the script of the webinar. But anyways, so and what I wanted to say too, that is actually legislation. Since President Clinton, who had an executive order back in the day where he focused on the civil rights of people, and he listed a non-discrimination list of people that included country of origin. That provision includes language justice.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's called the Affordable Healthcare Act. It's called the Section 1557. And then if we go through there again, the 50 states have pieces of legislation in favor of language justice that sometimes are better, more comprehensive than the federal ones. And there is a list about that I included in this. I created a document with all of the resources because I knew we were going to be rushing, and so I'm just giving you a little bit of that. But and language justice is actually about the dignity. People that are in a healthcare setting, they should be able to access those services with the language that they feel the most comfortable, because it's something that is difficult for everybody. And so I hope that the movement, the HIV movement, is starting to gear towards not using language justice as an after effect or send me to translate things when I suggest to be translated. And then we also putting together a project, hopefully soon, that will provide services to the HIV community by people living with HIV. And so we're working on that because I feel that without addressing language justice, we cannot address racial justice.
Wow, you're absolutely right. I love that. One thing I would say, you started off talking about politically correct, and I'll go to Miss Kiara because I'm getting ready to go to her. Who determines what's politically correct? Again, it goes back to what white cis men has decided what is right and fair for us. So I think you don't have to be in the status quo of political correct, because again, MIPA says that we get to bring our voice, our life, and our experience into this. Kiara, I'm gonna ask you to come on, talk about a little bit around continuum of care. Then I got one more question I want to bring to Vanessa around employment and economic justice. And we're gonna have to move on because we have some calls of action, a little bit more things to go with. But Kiara, come talk to us just a little bit around some of the continuum of care.
Absolutely, thank you, Linda. And I just want to also say, absolutely, Marcos. I think about, especially in Oakland, probably was like 10, 15 years ago, the African-American community in Oakland, they were trying to get their city to recognize African-American vernacular, right? Because language is resistance as well, And so when we talk about language justice, we also have to think about language as resistance, and that's how we connect with one another in ways that academics would never understand. And so, we're going to have to really make sure that that's part of these conversations as well. But continuum of care is really making sure that from cradle to the grave, right, that we are taken care of, right? Here in New York City, the city is really good at focusing on the youth, making sure that the youth have housing. We have several housing programs specifically for the youth, especially LGBTQIA youth. But once they get to the magical age of 26, right, the city cuts them loose, and they find themselves homeless. They find themselves being preyed upon, right? And so what that speaks to is that systems that we operate in, they have to be dismantled and created in a way that is going to create a safety net throughout our lives. Because 26, you're no longer considered a young adult. So you're going to have to wait till you're like 50, 55 to get benefits again. That's a long period of time to expect folks to navigate without any type of support, especially Black and brown trans women and Black and brown folks in general. So continuum of care is something that we have to fight for. Here in New York City, we did a TGNC virtual advocacy day last Thursday, and I had a conversation with my senator, Senator Kevin Parker, who's an amazing brother who represents my district of Flatbush. And so he's sponsoring a bill called Universal Basic Income, right? And so that's what we need to start talking about as well. How do we make sure that there's continuum of care for everyone? It's by creating policies that make sure that, I really hate that overused phrase, a rising tide lifts all boats, because that's not true. But like with universal basic income, it's a way to make sure that everyone has access to healthcare and housing, right? And other things that we may need. So we're going to have, one of the things we're working on, I just had a call with him earlier today, is really doing a data study on UBI. I know there's some like 43 mayors, mainly Black and brown mayors, who have pilot programs throughout the United States. And for most of that data I've seen, it's been very successful. And so it's really about educating the community about their rights. And one of the things I tell folks in New York City, Black and brown folks pay the most into the unions and 401ks in New York City, right? And when you see these cis white men on Wall Street talking about stock trades and bonds and all that, they're playing with our money. That's our money.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I'm gonna have to stop you. I'm gonna have to stop.
Can I just add something?
That's part of the continuum of life, not just care. That's part of the continuum of life. V, I'm gonna go ahead, V, real quick.
I'm just gonna real quick on this, and then I'll deal with unemployment. Unemployment. And that's the current state. A lot of people are, but we're going to talk about employment. I just wanted to add to what Kira is saying, and that the HIV National Strategic Plan talks about across the lifespan, but it's very much still tied to discrete population categories and time-limited interventions. And so I know when we were preparing for this session, we talked about creating a framework for aging across the lifespan, just as Kira has said, from the cradle to the grave, and also addressing the needs of an aging population. We have to be clear that this population is aging, and we have to deal with medical issues, social isolation, and maintenance of function. That's what I wanted to say.
Wow.
That's got to overlap. That framework's got to overlap that continuum of care.
V, can you do employment in like 90 seconds? I know it's going to be dirty, but I want to bring everybody back on so we can have a little bit of time together with the whole panel, because we have a call to action. We have some stuff that we need. We need the community to be with us. So come on, give us about 90 seconds.
Great. A lot of these recommendations have been vetted by the National Working Positive Coalition. So I will just say it. They recommend removing Ryan-White disallowance of employment services, requiring the AETCs or the AIDS Education Training Centers to implement training on benefits and addressing employment needs. And they are saying that every federal agency, including the Department of Labor's Employment and Training Administration, which is not part of the federal structure, interagency task force, be included to ensure cross-agency collaboration to respond to the needs of people living with HIV in partnership with people living with HIV networks.
Wow, I love it. I love it. I love it. Jess, I'm gonna give you guys like 15 seconds. What's your last word? We're gonna, Nana and everybody's gonna get ready to come back with us. Kira, what's one word?
Oh, wow. One word is shift. Shift our energy, shift our focus, and
shift. Lorenzo, one word.
Oh, I'll say two. People first.
All right.
Yay.
Marco, one word.
Liberation.
Vanessa.
Dignity. We have to keep fighting for our dignity. Wow. We know when it's not there.
This panel has been fabulous. You guys are meeple all the way. Y'all have not followed any of my directions. Y'all have done it your way, but it was fabulous. Nana, we're going to invite the other panelists to come on. There's a lot of questions. We know this in the chat, and we just want to have a broad discussion. Thank you guys for being with me. This has been fabulous. Hey, where's Nana? I see you, Nana. So how do we want to open this up? Let me look at the chat while you opening up.
Awesome. Thank you so much to our fierce panelists. Wow. I've just listening to you and learning so much from you all. And thank you, Linda, for holding that space so beautifully. Yeah, we have a few questions that have been coming in the comments on Facebook. And I want to just remind everyone to drop your questions, your comments into Facebook. We're watching them. We're watching the live stream. And this is the time where the presenters are going to engage directly with the issues you're raising. So one of the questions we heard from Dion Hawkins a little bit earlier in the session was, are there certain initiatives or examples that you all believe can be followed that can address some of the structural and systemic issues around the response that the first panel was raising? Who's doing this the right way? What are they doing differently? And particularly, Dion is pointing out that Cecilia's comment on compensation and the importance of layman language made him curious about other best practices that can be shared. Does anybody want to speak to that? So I think this question is really about what are some really good examples of MIPA, who's doing it well, what could be replicated or built upon, and other types of systemic issues.
The crickets we're hearing,
I know it.
volumes. So I would say that folks, anybody I've seen do this well are people who are most impacted or closer to the ground. Definitely not the federal government. I would say I work with one program that I'll give a shout out to the Sustain team at University of Houston, who not only we have an advisory group and we are compensated every month for our involvement, but also, you know, we've been able to shape language. We've been able to include MIPA as a part of a requirement for grant funding, you know, and the way that we look at funding, the way that we look at evaluating applications and being able to look at who gets funded and ensuring that everyone is on that group that are people living with HIV are compensated for their time monthly. But I can't, the crickets we're hearing is because folks aren't doing this right unless they're the people most impacted, like Thrive SS, people living with the Caucus, PWN, Positively Trans. We are the ones that are really the experts on this.
And I think you're right, Vanita. Go ahead, Cecilia.
I want to say, sadly, you know, like we don't print money. So like those who actually, you know, like gave us the resources kind of limited like how much we can give back to the community. And I think that Vanita just like hit it on the nail, is that networks, especially most impacted, trying, you know, like to have these conversations about what it means, you know, to be meaningfully compensated. Think of like if we have a convenings and, you know, like we have POHIV attending and some of the PHIV might be just working in hourly jobs, you know, are you telling them to sacrifice their income just to come to like participate in the convening? No, you know, like we need to like make sure that, you know, those are being compensated, you know, in a way that is equitable. Otherwise, you know, like we're just creating like more challenges for people in order for them to participate.
Yes, and we also have to be considered subject matter experts. I know Linda coined this phrase, and we need to hone in on that because we are talking about more than just presentations. We are talking about actually becoming a fabric of the HIV workforce and beyond that.
And we also have to, I think, as kind of the leaders or seniors, elders, whoever we are, that's 30 and up, you know, we have to be able to show people how to do that. You know, we have to have spaces where folks can have access to how do you cost out the value and negotiate your space at the table. You know, not at the Ron White table, your financial cost for your time. And it's not the same amount that you may get paid hourly, or if you have a salary, it doesn't matter. I'm coming to your table, not a representative of them. I'm coming to the table because I have something that you need and you have to access my community to get it. So I agree with Vanita. I don't think a lot of folks outside of the small circle are doing the MIPA. And I think it's one of the things we may have to figure out, how do we create an implementation plan? How do people actually implement MIPA into their structure space?
And I think, I mean, this is something that the Caucus and others do provide technical assistance on and advise on. And so we want to also urge folks to contract the people living with HIV networks to provide expertise to you.
And I also shout out to some funders who've been listening to like us, you know, like sharing with them like why they need to change the way they make the application works for like PHIV and trans-led organizations. So I want to give a shout out to AIDS United. I want to give a shout out to like Trans Justice Funding Project. You know, it's really, you know, they kind of like set, you know, like the standards of like what it means, you know, to compensate people's times, you know, like when they have like expert panels to come and review, you know, grants, you know, like when they say expert panels, that means, you know, people impacted, you know, like in the community that gets to come and, you know, look at all the different proposals and decide, you know, like which one they think their community would benefit most, you know, and I think that that kind of model is really important. And get rid of like the written proposal concept, because sometimes, people articulate better when they say their words out loud. Some of them, do better because, we are living in like live stream kind of like culture, like people do it better when they hold the phone like in front, and speak in front of a camera. So like we need to give people a variety of options, like to be able to express their visions and, and like what they plan to do with the community.
I love that, Cecilia. I think it goes back to what Vanita was saying earlier around, who we're writing for, right? So we know that there are a number of organizations that hire people or they have staff that write to the academia, write to that space, but they're not the ones on the ground making the reality, making it happen in that space. So if we're living, even in our funders, we have some great funders, but there still is a silo of who's getting those core resources, unless you have some relationship space where somebody will throw you off, a Snickers bar, snack size Snicker bar to say you're in. So there's a real silo there. So looking at how do we diversify funding opportunities? I understand the written piece, but some of us can't out budget what some folks are doing. That I hear Kiara say, we're grassroots, and the fund, we have to create different silos of opportunities of people living with HIV, organizations to be able to access funding, because there are other bigger organizations who may access it, but they're still not hitting boots on the ground space at the same level of impact, but for a lesser dollar amount. I'm sure what some of us are doing. I know. Go ahead, Nana.
No, go ahead and finish. We do have some other questions that I want to make sure we get to.
I'm gonna go ahead because I love that fact that we have to look at it. Can't be continue to be one source where all the funding come. We have to look at how we're set up as organizations and how do we create equity in competitive processing for funding for different needs. So yeah, that's it.
Yeah, thank you. I know this is an issue that folks have a lot of ideas about and strong feelings about, and that our communities have a ton of expertise in. We also had a couple of questions come up about HIV and aging, and I know that both Ronald and Vanessa had mentioned that in their comments. And so one of the specific questions was, is there any indication that this administration will focus on those aging with HIV? And this is coming from Wahida Shabazz El.
I can take a start on that. I think there is some indication at HRSA and specifically the HIV/AIDS Bureau. I think there are officials there, and certainly the Dr. Cheever is, I believe, very focused and aware of the issue of HIV and aging, and are beginning to address that. I think, though, there is still what I consider and many other a disconnect, because the attention and the focus that is being seen, at least to my eyes, at the federal level, still has not been really effectively translated into on-the-ground changes, and the changes in models of care that would more effectively address the issues of HIV and aging, the integration of geriatric care with HIV care, the education of specialists who are dealing with the various comorbidities that highly impact older adults living with HIV. And many of those specialists, cardiologists, are not as aware of HIV and aware of the impact that HIV might have on those comorbidities, such as the impact of HIV on cardiovascular disease. I think, and many of us think, there is still a gap in that knowledge base. And even looking at HIV specialists who may not be educated, aware of geriatrics and the impact of the aging process on HIV and how that interaction plays out. So I think there is awareness at the federal level, and officials in HAP, that is the HIV/AIDS Bureau, I think are genuinely committed to doing this, but there still needs to be work to translate that so that the people in communities, the people who are living and aging with HIV, can see differences in their care. And I think that is, again, why advocacy is so very important. We have to advocate more. We have to come up with specific recommendations. HAB has to do this. Planning councils have to do this. Their funding streams have to be adjusted so that the kinds of support services that people living and aging with HIV need are there. So there's awareness at the federal level, but we as advocates need more work to make that be realized at the local living level so that older adults can indeed thrive.
Hey, Nana, can I ask a quick question kind of to the audience? And I know we won't be able to get direct responses, but Ronald just said something, we are the advocates, across the country, us people living with HIV. Many of us are living on and working on and volunteering on these planning bodies. If the caucus would come up with a list with our recommendations, would you be willing to take them to your planning body? Because we can come up with it, but we really need you to be willing to take them out and actualize them in your home community. So I wanted to ask because I would love to see some responses in the chat. Are you willing to take this message, and bring it to life on your planning bodies, on those decision-making tables that many of us have been trained, have been taught to sit at and to be at a voice at?
And I'll just jump in and just piggyback on what Ronald said. Ronald, thank you for that comprehensive response. The only thing I would add is that we as a community must demand seats also on the indicator subcommittee of the Interagency Federal Task Force, because it is there that we can really put some meat to the bone in terms of developing indicators which will help improve not just our quality of life across the lifespan, but really get and hone into what our specific needs are as a community around aging. I'm 63. I'm getting ready to retire. We know in the United States, there is no retirement package. Linda, stop it. There is no retirement. There's no retirement in the United States anymore. There is no safety net. All the safety nets have been abolished. So we have to get on these bodies. They're incremental change, I understand. So we need an inside-outside game, but we got to be there. We just have to be there.
There is such an important point, Vanessa. I think that's the reality is we're not just doing this out of the goodness of our heart. We need that paycheck to survive, and that's also a message that we need to get back, to the policymakers is that, yes, we all would like to retire tomorrow, comfortably, but we can't because we still have rent or mortgage to pay. We have car payment to pay, and we still have to put food on the table, and we cannot rely on that social security check, to live on, because, the standard of living in different cities are different, until we can really fix that broken systems, we have a lot to work on. And also I want to also touch on, the questions about, how do we make sure that the community most impacted, access treatment, have those providers come to us, and let us help them, get the education out. Guess who knows where the community is? The, people who are part of that community. So, so for us, trans people of color know exactly where to find other trans people of color. We don't expect our cis white allies to know where we go and, and what kind of entertainment or venues that we go to. But for a trans woman of color, she knows where another trans woman of color or, a bigger group of trans women of color goes. So give that to us, you know, and allow us to be involved and get compensated into getting these messages and education out about treatment. And I think that, you know, that's a lot that we can say, you know, but it's not about going to a doctor's office, you know, with the pharmaceutical lab representative and let the providers know, oh, these are the new medications, you know, like, because they don't know the side effects. We do. Like, so we need to have these conversations with our own communities and our own families, you know, in order for them to be truly educated and informed.
Linda, I just want to say one thing. I love the question you just asked about folks taking back to their planning bodies, but one of the things of advocacy is the planning bodies are bureaucratic mechanisms, and we got to teach people how you bring that back there, because all of them have processes. I mean, you gotta understand the game to be a player in it, and you got just bringing it up in a meeting ain't the way to get it in there. Because you know the rules, you know it's a train that moves whether people get on it or not. It is not the most transparent and inclusive place. So we need to teach people, whether it's in the how to best meet the need, where is the process that you can bring something back versus just say bring it back. Let's tell them how, because we know you're going to be frustrated if you don't understand the game. You got to know the play to be able to play the game with them.
I also want to say very quickly, can you hear me? That as we do all this work here in the US, we need to reflect also on the rest of the world. Because if we don't have a retirement plan here in the US, let me tell you something. In Namibia, there is zero. And so I think that as an advocate, as a grassroots organizer, it is a good practice to actually look down to the South, look down to where people of color are and where we come from, to actually regain. Sometimes the best ideas and the better solutions come from them, but we just don't do it. And so I will invite everybody, as we do human rights framework work, then let's also be culturally relevant or humbled about the work that we do, and remember that we're not just here in the US, that there is people that every single action of us actually affects their lives. I think that that's a good reflection for all of us.
Yeah, thank you so much. We are getting towards the end of our time, and we do have some recommendations and some next steps that we wanted to put forward as well. But before we move there, I just want to invite any of our panelists who haven't spoken in this section to offer any closing reflections if you haven't responded to the questions. If there's anything else you wanted to share, any other insights?
Can you hear me? I don't know.
We can hear you.
Thank you, Nana. Yeah, I just really think it's really important for us to always remember the holistic approach is very important when we talk about how we want to address the needs of our community and all its intersectionalities. The reality is, as we continue to see public execution of Black and Brown folks, that impacts, our mental health. And I just think about the scene. I didn't see the movie. I just know that she got an award for it, Halle Berry, right? And Halle Berry, she was going through like some type of emotional breakdown, and she just wanted to feel a connection, right? And she said, I just want you to make me feel good, right? And so when we think about like why there is a lack of progress on why like Black and Brown folks are not accessing healthcare the same way, is because we're not addressing racism, anti-Blackness, right? These systems that bombards us every day, to where we just, we, rather than probably take care of our health, we just want somebody to make us feel good, right? So we don't go for that follow-up. And so it's important that as we have these conversations, we understand that that is the root problem that we have as a community across this nation, is that we're not understanding how racism has truly impacted Black and Brown communities.
And
go ahead, Marco.
Go ahead, Lorenzo.
Yeah, and I just want to say, and this is kind of for us here, after being being in the work for a little bit and maybe pursuing further education, there may be a degree of detachment that we here may have from those that we serve on the day-to-day. It was very enlightening for me to have a phone call with someone I linked to CARE last year. And in that, I learned something. So I just want us here to keep in mind that we always have to keep our ear to the ground to those we're serving and listen to them and keep gauging them for how they want their services provided.
Joe, very quickly before we go, I also wanted to answer a question of our dear, amazing moderator. When you were talking about which organizations are doing the work, I have to say that Positive Women's Network USA is doing the work. And every time that I look at the efforts during the elections, the work that we did, creating safety groups so we can be okay, I'm always so inspired and so I gain strength by just seeing the work that you do. And so I wanted to uplift your work because you also have been one of the most best allies for the immigrant work that I do, or the immigration work that I do. And then the last thing that I want to say too is that as we talk about MIPA, GIPA, and the Denver principles, we also need to remember that we need to include racial justice frame lens after that. MIPA without racial justice is nothing. Nothing for me. No, it's not. So I think that all of these entities that we use and that I love, we need to start actually being more intentional at speaking about how is it for people that are Black or people of color.
Thank you all so much. This has been such a powerful conversation, and I think you can see why we needed 2 hours for this event and why we really need 2 more hours and 2 more hours with these folks and many more folks in our community who have a lot of expertise to contribute. And so one of the things we want you to know is that this is not the last event we're doing. This is the first conversation of people living with HIV networks coming together to say, we've been looking at this strategy. We have read the HIV National Strategic Plan. We have carefully examined the End the Epidemic plan. We have read the Ryan White legislation. We are really clear, and our lives are directly impacted by these policies and these programs. And we're coming to the community to say, we have some ideas about how the response can be better. We need to be centered. We are actually part of the response as people living with HIV. We need to not be an afterthought. The response, I think, as we've heard throughout this panel, is really plagued by a lot of different forms of stigma and marginalization, from racism and anti-Blackness, which are, the exact reasons why PrEP implementation has not worked in the ways that it's needed to reach the communities that it needs to. Those patterns are replicated in COVID vaccine access. Those patterns are replicated, as ACE is pointing out, in HIV treatment access and who's engaged in care. This is not a surprise, right? Like racism, anti-Blackness, and frankly, misogyny really plague the HIV response domestically and globally. And that's why still in 2021, there's literally no mention of sexual and reproductive health of people living with HIV in the HIV National Strategic Plan. There is no mention of the fact that people living with HIV still have sexual and reproductive lives, and that accessing sexual and reproductive health care is one of the greatest sites of discrimination for people of all genders living with HIV. That's invisible in the plan. The fact that people living with HIV, when we look at these plans, we see ourselves portrayed as merely vectors of transmission that have to be managed and controlled. That is HIV stigma at the highest levels of institutionalization, right? HIV stigma shows up in criminalization laws and things like that, but it also shows up in the fact that we are only recognized as problems to be managed by our own government that is not fully accounting for our lives and that is reducing our wellness, our quality of life to our viral load metrics. So so there's a lot of work we can do together to transform this and change it. And I believe it is entirely possible. I want to let you know quickly about a couple of other things that are coming up that we're hoping you can join us for, because there's a lot of work we can do together if I can find my slide deck. Am I sharing?
Not yet.
That's it. Yep, here it comes.
Yes.
Okay, cool. So very quickly, these are our recommendations around structural interventions into the response. I'm not going to read all of these. You heard them in, much more articulately from our speakers and presenters. We will be releasing a policy agenda in the next couple of months that will have all of this in much more detail. But here are some of the recommendations we're recommending in terms of changing the way that we approach the HIV response, period, in the United States. We also have recommendations to improve the focus on people living with HIV. And again, you heard a lot of these directly from the presenters, and I won't speak to them. What I do want to let you know about is that we have some opportunities to get involved. We're going to be having a community listening session. I saw the question also, how can we hear from more people about what some of the priorities are? This is an iterative process. We are going to be hosting a week from today, a community listening session for people living with HIV only, where the networks are hosting this space to listen to people living with HIV about what's live for us as a community. What are the policy changes we want to see? What's really happening on the ground? We're going to be using that to inform the development of our policy agenda. And we'll continue to host events overall, kind of throughout the year. So stay tuned, sign up, go to hivcaucus.org. If someone could drop that into the comments, that would be great. Yes, that's the registration link for our May 11th session. hivcaucus.org is a way to get involved. If you want to see the policy agenda when it comes out, please go to pwn-usa.org and sign up on our list. We'll make sure that you get that, as well as the invitation to any other events that we're going to be hosting together. I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Linda to close us out today.
Wow, Nana, this is absolutely fabulous. Everyone, this has been a fabulous time. As Nana said, we probably could be 2 more hours with you. I want to say in closing, I want to thank all of the panelists. As Nana said, this is just the beginning. So I want to thank you guys all for allowing me to be with you. This has been a great think tank of people living with HIV, taking a stand, and not just taking a stand, we're turning the page to you next. We need you to be with us on May the 11th, right? We don't want to just be the privileged group of Black people, brown people living with HIV. We need to hear your voices. We want to be at all corners of the country, all corners of everywhere. Please be with us on March the 11th. That is so we can take not just what we have, but what you have, and translate and influence the policy document that we will be developing, not just on behalf of the caucus. We are a representation of all 1.2 million people living in this country. So we need your voices, your insight. Again, we want to thank you, Nana, Vanita, Kiara, Marco, Ronald, Cecilia, Lorenzo, Vanessa, and there's so many people behind the scenes, right? And all of those folks who are moving the slides and taking notes, everyone has been part of this. We thank you. Please read, please listen out. But more than anything, please let somebody know that this happened today and let them know to be with us on May the 11th. Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.